He built an empire, but he never learned how to be a father. What happens when the man who spent his life chasing power returns to find the one thing he never expected: a child who looks just like him, but doesn't even know his name? Daniel Whitmore was a millionaire CEO, celebrated in boardrooms and headlines, but a trip to a quiet town in Idaho changes everything when he walks into a diner and sees his former assistant and the little girl beside her. What would you do if you discovered you had a daughter you never knew existed? Would you run? Would you explain? Or would you stay? Even if staying is the hardest thing you've ever done. This is a story about second chances, silent sacrifices, and the quiet courage it takes to rebuild a life not with money, but with presence. If this story touches something in you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. We read every word. Now, come with us to the lakeside town of Maple Lake, where one man will finally learn what it means to come home. He came for business. He didn't expect to see her face again, let alone beside a child who looked just like him. Daniel Whitmore stepped out of his rental SUV and stretched his back, the ache of a 3-hour drive from Boise settling somewhere between his shoulders. The town of Maple Lake, Idaho, welcomed him with a crisp breeze and the smell of damp pine. It was the kind of place where mornings still carried the scent of wood smoke, and the sidewalks knew every step that had ever touched them. He hadn't been in a town like this in over 20 years. Seattle had taken him in, reshaped him, sharpened him. Daniel Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Buildtech, wasn't supposed to belong in places with wind chimes on porches or rustling leaves dancing across gravel roads. But here he was, scouting land for a potential eco-resort, something his investors believed would capture the soul of the rustic traveler. A little diner by the lake had popped up in his search for authentic, local experience. He didn't expect much. Probably black coffee, eggs with too much butter, and laminated menus with peeling corners. He certainly didn't expect her. The bell above the door gave a gentle chime as he stepped inside. The warmth hit him first wood-paneled walls, the gentle hum of a vinyl record player in the corner, and the comforting scent of maple syrup and cinnamon. It felt lived in. It felt like someone still cared. And there she was, Ellie Sanders, pouring coffee for an elderly man at the counter. Her back turned for a moment, then her profile sharp, familiar, unchanged in ways that time usually doesn't allow. Her hair was pulled into a low bun, a few strands falling loose at the temples. She wore a green apron over a plain button-down shirt. No makeup, no pretense, still effortlessly graceful, still entirely Ellie. Daniel froze. He hadn't seen her in nearly a decade, not since she'd walked away from his company without so much as a goodbye. She turned. Their eyes met. A flicker recognition, disbelief, a shadow of something deeper flashed across her face before she tucked it neatly behind a professional smile. "Table for one," she asked, voice even. Daniel nodded. "Yes, please." She led him to a window seat overlooking the lake, handed him a menu, and offered, "Coffee to start, sure." He replied, his voice catching slightly, "Black." She nodded and walked away, leaving behind the faint trace of citrus hand soap and something warmer, something like memory. He followed her with his eyes, still unsure if this was real. And then, from the corner of the diner, a little girl appeared. She was sitting at a booth by herself, swinging her legs, scribbling in a notebook, around 9 years old. Wavy brown hair tied in a loose ponytail, cheeks pink from the cold morning air. But it was her eyes that stopped him, large, thoughtful, the kind that held more behind them than a child should have to carry. And yet soft, Familiar. So familiar, in fact, that Daniel's breath caught mid-inhale. His mind whispered, "No, that's not possible." And yet... The little girl looked up from her drawing and met his gaze. Just for a second, Daniel's heart gave a strange thud, recognition twisted with something dangerously close to fear. She turned back to her paper. Ellie returned with the coffee and set it down gently. "Special today is blueberry pancakes with house-made syrup," she said. "I recommend it." Daniel nodded slowly. "I'll take it." Again, that polite smile. Not cold, not warm either. Just enough distance to say, "Let's not go there." He didn't ask. Not yet. As she walked away, she paused by the little girl's table. The child beamed up at her, showing her the drawing. Ellie bent down, brushed a curl from the girl's forehead, and kissed the top of her head. Daniel felt that moment in his chest, something tender, something painful. He stirred his coffee. Not because it needed it, but because his hands didn't know what else to do. The pancakes arrived. Warm, soft, perfectly golden. But he barely touched them. Every so often, he glanced over at the child. And every so often, she glanced back. His thoughts wouldn't settle. The math added up too cleanly. The timeline, Ellie's sudden departure, her radio silence, the girl's age. He remembered that week. 9 years ago, Ellie had taken a personal day, then never returned. Is it possible? He didn't dare ask. Not here. Not like this. When he finished eating, he walked to the counter to pay. Ellie rang him up. Their eyes met again, but she said nothing more than, "Have a good day." "You too," Daniel replied, quietly. As he stepped outside, the wind met him like an old friend. Leaves rustled beneath his shoes, and the lake shimmered in the distance, reflecting a sky smeared in pale blue and early cloud. He stood there for a long moment, keys in hand, not ready to start the engine. That little girl. He hadn't come here for memories or for regret. But now, both clung to him like morning frost. Tomorrow, he'd come back, not for the pancakes, not even for Ellie, but for the question that refused to let him go. Before she disappeared, she was the only person who knew him beyond the titles and the meetings. Before the boardrooms, the magazine covers, the elevator pitches and capital rounds, there was just Daniel Whitmore and a folding desk in a cramped co-working space in downtown Seattle. And Ellie Sanders, always one step ahead of him, even when they were both too young to know exactly where they were headed. He hadn't thought about those early years in a long time. Life had become too fast, too crowded, but something about seeing her again after all this time, in a place so far from the chaos they once shared, unlocked a door he hadn't realized was still there. Back then, she was 25, fresh out of business school, but with an instinct for organization that no resume could capture. He'd hired her after a 10-minute coffee interview where she fixed a typo on his pitch deck without being asked. He hadn't looked back since for 7 years. Ellie was more than his assistant. She was the only person who stayed when things got ugly. When funding fell through, when vendors backed out, when he slept in the office and missed birthdays, she was there. She remembered his mother's favorite flowers and ordered them every year on her birthday. She kept a box of granola bars in her desk for the days he forgot to eat. She knew when to speak and when silence was the only kindness. She also knew when he was hurting, even when he swore he wasn't. They had built that company together, not equally in name, but equally in spirit. He remembered the long nights, 2 laptops open side by side, the city lights flickering through their office windows. Sometimes they worked in silence, Other times an easy conversation that wandered far from spreadsheets. There were takeout boxes on the floor and half-drunk cups of tea. There were jokes she could make that no one else would dare. There were glances that lingered just a beat too long. Daniel had known, even then, that something real had been growing in the quiet spaces between them. But he had also known the rules he'd made for himself. No personal distractions, no entanglements. Love was a risk, and risk had no place in the empire he was building. He was chasing legacy, not intimacy, control, not vulnerability. And so he kept his distance. Every time she laughed too long at his jokes, he buried the warmth. Every time he saw exhaustion in her eyes, he offered more work instead of rest. He had learned how to want something deeply and still pretend he didn't. Then, one morning, just like that, she was gone. No farewell lunch, no 2 weeks' notice, just a short email to HR and an empty desk the next day. He remembered walking into the office, seeing her chair pushed in, her favorite pen gone, and thinking she wouldn't leave like this. But she had. He told himself he was too busy to dwell on it, that the timing was inconvenient, that she must have found something better. But underneath all those excuses, he knew the truth. She left because he gave her no reason to stay. The memory hit harder now. Sitting in his quiet hotel room in Maple Lake, looking out at a view that was all trees and water and no cell service. He remembered the last day she'd been in the office, a big investor meeting. She'd worn that navy blue dress she only pulled out for important events. She looked nervous. No, not nervous. Sad. He'd been too wrapped up in the presentation to notice the way her voice caught at the end of a sentence, the way she lingered in the doorway a second longer than usual. He'd meant to call her afterward, to check in, maybe even apologize. But the meeting ran long. Then another one started. Then a crisis hit in logistics, and by the time he looked up again, it had been 3 days, and Ellie was already gone. He let out a slow breath, pinching the bridge of his nose. 9 years. 9 years since that moment, and yet the shame of it still sat in his chest like a weight that refused to dissolve. What else did I miss back then? That question had started as a whisper. Now it throbbed like a drumbeat under his ribs. It wasn't just Ellie. He had missed birthdays, friends' weddings. His father's funeral was a blur between meetings. He'd built something magnificent, yes, but how many pieces of his life had been left behind in the process? The little girl's face flashed in his mind again. Her eyes. The way she tilted her head, just like he did when he was thinking. He didn't know yet what the truth was, but his instincts were no longer sleeping. Ellie had once known him better than anyone, and she had walked away carrying a silence that now echoed louder than any memory. You can ignore your past, but sometimes it finds its way back in the eyes of a child. The next morning, Daniel returned to the diner earlier than before. The mist was still lifting off the lake, and the parking lot held only a few trucks, likely locals, grabbing breakfast before a day of honest work. He had barely slept. The quiet of the hotel room had been too loud. The silence of unanswered questions refused to leave him alone. He stepped inside. The same soft bell above the door chimed. The same smell of warm maple and fresh coffee wrapped around him like a familiar song. Ellie was behind the counter, speaking with a waitress. Her face turned toward him out of habit, and for a moment, just a flicker. Her expression softened before she smoothed it into something unreadable. Back again, she asked as he took the same seat by the window. I guess I liked the pancakes, he said, attempting a small smile. She nodded. Same thing today. Daniel hesitated. Sure, and maybe a moment of your time, if you can spare it. Her eyes held his for a second too long before she turned away. "I'll see what I can do." As she walked off, Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The diner was quiet, almost peaceful, and for a while he just sat with his coffee, watching the lake glimmer through the window. It was strange how quickly a place could begin to feel like it mattered. Then, just like the morning before, she appeared. The girl. She slid into the booth across the room, notebook in hand, legs swinging slightly beneath the table. There was something careful in the way she moved, as if she was used to taking up as little space as possible. But her eyes, they were wide, curious, and oddly old for someone so small. Daniel watched her quietly. He didn't want to stare, but he couldn't help it. There was a certain way she furrowed her brow when she concentrated, the same way he did when reviewing contracts, the slight tilt of her head when she listened, the way her left hand hovered just above the table like it didn't quite know where to rest. Then came Ellie, placing a plate in front of Daniel. One stack of pancakes. And one question. Apparently, Daniel gave a small nod. "She's your daughter?" "Yes." Ellie's voice didn't invite conversation. "She seems thoughtful." "She is." Daniel hesitated. "How old is she?" Ellie looked at him, her jaw tightening just enough to be noticeable. Then she glanced toward the girl. "She'll be 9 next month." That was all she said, but it was enough. Daniel's heart gave a slow, deliberate thud. 9. Ellie had left the company almost 9 years ago. He blinked, eyes fixed on the condensation forming on his glass. His throat felt dry, though his coffee sat untouched. She left without a word. She'd vanished. And months later, she'd given birth to a little girl with his eyes. The pieces didn't come together. They slammed, they collided, and he sat there, silent as the puzzle he'd never tried to solve suddenly finished itself. "I didn't know you had a family," he said softly. Ellie's posture stiffened. "It's just the two of us." Daniel nodded, trying not to let the question in his eyes spill out of his mouth. The question he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. The girl Lila looked up from her notebook and caught his gaze. She gave him the smallest smile. Just a hint. Just enough to unravel him. "Lila!" Ellie called gently. "Why don't you come say hello?" The girl hopped down, still holding her notebook, and walked over. She stood by Ellie's side, glancing curiously at Daniel. "This is Mr. Whitmore," Ellie said. "He's an old friend." The word friend landed somewhere soft and distant, like a photograph left in a drawer. "Hi," Lila said shyly. Daniel's voice felt tight, but he smiled. "Hi there. That's a beautiful drawing you have." Lila held it out. A sketch of the lake, trees leaning in from the edges, tiny ducks across the water. The perspective was off, but the feeling was there. It had depth. "Did you draw this all by yourself?" he asked. She nodded. "Mama says I see stories in pictures." Daniel's smile flickered. So had her mother. Once. Ellie had always seen meaning in the margins, in details others missed. Apparently, her daughter had inherited that gift. "It's lovely," he said. "You're very talented." Lila beamed, then scurried back to her booth. Ellie watched her go, arms folded, her expression unreadable. Daniel finally spoke, more carefully this time. "Would you ever want to talk? Maybe a walk around the lake sometime?" There was a pause. Ellie didn't look at him. Her eyes were still on her daughter. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe." And then she walked away. He stayed until the end of his meal, though he couldn't taste a bite of it. As he stepped outside, the wind off the lake caught the collar of his coat. The air smelled of pine and something older, something like memory. 9 years. 1,000 missed moments, and a chance, just maybe, to ask the questions he never had the courage to face. Some truths aren't shouted, they're carried in silence. For years, they met at the edge of the lake just after 6. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dock and turning the water into a rippling mirror of burnt gold. Ellie stood waiting, hands tucked into the sleeves of her cardigan, a breeze teasing loose strands of her hair. Daniel approached slowly, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound for a long moment. No words at first, just the quiet rhythm of footfalls as they began to walk the narrow trail that looped around Maple Lake. For a while, they didn't speak. And that silence wasn't empty. It was dense, full of memory, full of questions neither of them knew how to ask. The trees above whispered as the breeze moved through them. Ducks drifted across the still water, somewhere far off. A dog barked once, then fell silent again. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "She's special," he said softly. "Lila." Ellie didn't stop walking, but her shoulders shifted ever so slightly. "She is. She looks a lot like you," he offered. Ellie let out a quiet breath, a smile flickering almost sad. "Some days, yes. And some days." Daniel's voice trailed. He didn't finish the sentence. They walked a few more paces. Then Ellie stopped. "She's yours." "Daniel." The words landed like stones dropped into water. Quiet, simple, but deep enough to drown in. Daniel turned toward her. His mouth opened, then closed, his mind struggling to catch up to what his heart had already suspected. He began, but no words followed. Ellie's gaze didn't waver. Her voice stayed calm, but her eyes shone with something else, grief. Maybe, or exhaustion. "I found out I was pregnant 2 months after I left the company," she said. "I wrote to you, sent an email. Nothing dramatic, just the facts. Really. I didn't want to accuse or beg. I just thought you had the right to know." Daniel felt a tightness in his chest, old and unfamiliar. "I never saw it," he whispered. "The email. God, Ellie, I didn't know." She gave a small nod. "I figured that much. After a while, I stopped waiting for a response." "Why didn't you try again?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost pleading. Ellie looked out over the lake. Her face was calm, but her eyes told a different story. "Because you were already gone," she said. "Even before I left. You were somewhere else, building something bigger than either of us. And she paused, steadying her breath. "I didn't want to be the thing that pulled you back." Daniel looked down at the dirt path beneath them. He remembered the chaos of that time launches, deadlines, investors, nights spent hunched over spreadsheets until dawn. He remembered being exhausted, driven, distracted, but he didn't remember her walking away with a secret that would change his life. "She never asked about me," he asked softly. "No," Ellie said. "I didn't want her growing up wondering why you didn't want her. I thought, if you weren't in the picture, it was cleaner, kinder." The words cut deeper than she knew. "I would have wanted her," Daniel said. "I would have." His voice cracked. "I missed everything." He turned away, rubbing a hand over his face. The wind had picked up, bringing with it the scent of pine needles and lake water. The air felt suddenly colder. I missed her first steps, her first words, the way she holds a pencil, her bedtime stories. 9 years she's still here. Ellie interrupted gently. "And so are you." Daniel met her eyes again, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. There was no blame in her voice, no anger, just truth. And he realized that was what hurt most. She hadn't kept Lila from him to punish him. She had done it to protect their daughter and maybe to protect herself. "I want to know her," Daniel said at last. His voice was quiet, but it didn't waver. Ellie studied him for a moment. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just nodded once, like she'd been waiting for him to say that. The wind rustled the leaves above them. Somewhere on the other side of the lake, a loon called out, low and haunting. They kept walking, side by side. Not quite close enough to touch, but close enough for something to begin again. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But maybe a second chance. How do you talk to your child when she doesn't even know who you are? Daniel returned to the diner every morning. He didn't make a scene. He didn't bring flowers or ask for long talks. He just showed up quietly, consistently, always sitting at the same table near the window, always ordering the same thing. And Lila, she was always there, too. Some mornings, she sat alone with her sketchbook, legs swinging under the table. Other times, she helped fold napkins behind the counter or ran small plates to the tables like a proud little waitress in training. Daniel never said too much. He didn't want to rush what needed to unfold slowly. He greeted her warmly, complimented her drawings, asked little questions that didn't press too hard. "Is that the lake in your picture? Do ducks really sleep with one eye open? What's your favorite kind of muffin?" They talked about silly things, safe things, but every word meant more than it sounded. It was a thread, thin but strong, being slowly spun between them. Lila responded with a quiet curiosity. She was polite, bright, and cautious in the way children are when they've grown up watching adults a little too closely. But with Daniel, there was something else, a flicker of ease, a growing comfort. One morning, he brought her a pack of colored pencils, nothing fancy, just a small gesture. "For the artist," he said. She lit up, thanked him shyly, and pulled out her sketchbook on the spot. Daniel sat with his coffee, watching her draw with a concentration he envied, the kind that blocked out the whole world. Ellie watched from the counter. She didn't interfere. She didn't encourage either. But she saw the way her daughter's shoulders relaxed when Daniel was near. She saw the smile that crept in when he complimented a drawing, the small laugh when he joked about syrup being a food group. Ellie's heart was torn. She had protected Lila fiercely for nearly a decade. No missed pickups, no broken promises, no revolving door of strangers pretending to care, just the two of them steady, simple, safe. Now, here was Daniel, showing up, gently, day after day, not asking for forgiveness, not rushing into declarations, just being there. It was harder to resent him than she'd expected. One afternoon, just before the lunch rush, Lila walked over to Daniel's table with her sketchbook tucked behind her back. She stood beside him, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "I made something," she said. Daniel looked up, smiling. "Can I see?" She nodded and handed over the drawing. It was simple, crayon strokes on white paper, but it stole the breath from his lungs. A tall man, a woman, a little girl. All three standing under a large red maple tree. His throat tightened. The leaves overhead were painted bright, almost glowing. The trio held hands. The girl in the middle. "This is beautiful," he whispered. Lila looked down. "It's us." Daniel blinked. "Us." She nodded. "You, me, and Mama. I know you're not my dad or anything, but it's just a drawing." He held the paper with both hands, careful not to crease it. He wanted to tell her everything, that she was his daughter, that he would have given the world to have known her from the start, that she wasn't just a drawing, she was everything he never knew he needed. But instead, he smiled through the tightness in his chest and said, "It's perfect. Thank you." Lila grinned. "You can keep it." He nodded, too choked up to speak. From across the room, Ellie watched them, her hand stilled on a tray she was wiping. She saw Lila's joy, and she saw something else too. Daniel's face, open, unguarded, raw with emotion. It had been years since she'd seen him like that. Maybe she never had. Later that day, Daniel sat in his car, the drawing still resting in his hands. The paper felt warm from his grip, the lines wobbly, the colors bright. But the meaning, the meaning was everything. A family, a chance, a hope. He closed his eyes, pressed the picture to his chest, and whispered to himself, "I won't leave this time." He said he wouldn't leave, but old habits don't die quietly. Maple Lake Elementary's fall picnic had become something of a tradition. Parents brought blankets and lunchboxes. Teachers organized simple games, and children ran wild across the grass, trailing laughter behind them like streamers in the wind. For the first time, Daniel Whitmore was there. He stood a little awkwardly at first, coffee in hand, feeling overdressed in his tailored shirt among a sea of fleece jackets and faded jeans. But Lila tugged at his sleeve, urging him to follow her toward the cluster of red-checkered blankets where the second graders were gathering. She looked radiant in the sunlight. Her windbreaker was a little too big, her hat slightly crooked. But her smile was steady and real and aimed at him. Daniel hadn't felt this close to peace in years. They shared a blanket under a tall oak tree overlooking the lake. Lila unpacked the sandwiches cut into triangles, crusts removed, just how she liked them, and showed him the new sketch pad Ellie had given her. "I'm drawing the whole class," she said, eyes sparkling, even the loud ones. Daniel laughed. "You might need extra pages for that." They talked about art, about why ants always find the cookies first, about how maple leaves turn red before they fall. She offered him half of her apple slices. He accepted like it was treasure. For a little while, nothing else existed, until his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. 3 missed calls, all from Brandon, his CFO. He let it go, tucked the phone under the corner of the blanket. Then it buzzed again, and again, and again. Lila glanced up from her drawing. "You can get it if you need to." Daniel hesitated. "It's probably nothing," but the screen lit again, this time with a message in bold emergency. "Call now. Investor fallout. Project may implode." He stood slowly. "Lila, I need to take this call. Just for a few minutes. I'll be right back." "Okay." She nodded, eyes lowering back to her sketch pad. "Okay." He squeezed her shoulder gently, then walked toward the parking lot, phone already at his ear. The call wasn't short. It never is. A major investor had pulled out due to leaked project documents. Legal was involved. The timeline was collapsing. Brandon was panicking. And somewhere in the flurry of logistics and damage control, Daniel's mind clicked back into CEO mode. He forgot the lake, forgot the blanket, forgot the little girl sitting under the tree with her sketchbook waiting for him. When he looked at the time, nearly an hour had passed. He cursed under his breath, threw his phone on the passenger seat, and started the car. The drive back to the picnic felt longer than the drive to Idaho. Every bend in the road felt like a reminder. She was waiting, and you didn't come back. By the time he reached the park, the lot was nearly empty. Blankets gone, children gone. Even the tire swing swayed alone. Daniel stepped out, scanning the grass. His chest tightened, his breath caught. Lila was nowhere in sight. The hotel front desk clerk looked up as Daniel rushed in. "She's down the hall," he said gently. "Been sitting there a while." Daniel turned the corner and stopped. Lila was curled up on the bench outside the conference room, her backpack still on, her drawing pad in her lap, her ball cap tilted sideways. She looked up as he approached, but her expression didn't change. "Lila," he said, kneeling beside her. "I'm so sorry. I got pulled into something, and She didn't interrupt. She didn't look angry. She just said, very quietly, "He's not coming back." It wasn't a tantrum, not even sadness. Really, it was resignation, like something inside her had simply closed its door. Daniel's hands hovered in the air, uncertain. "I came back. I lost track of time. I didn't mean to." She stood up, brushing off her jacket. "Mom's coming." And she walked toward the lobby doors without another word. Daniel sat there, still crouched, the hallway spinning just slightly. 15 minutes later, there was a knock at his door, not gentle, not hesitant. It was sharp, firm, unforgiving. He opened it to find Ellie standing there, arms crossed, her face unreadable. No words were exchanged. Not yet. But the silence said everything. Some wounds aren't from what was said, but from the silence that followed. Ellie stood in the doorway of Daniel's hotel room, arms crossed, back straight, her expression unreadable except for the tightness around her eyes. She didn't wait for him to invite her in. She stepped past him, her boots clicking against the polished floor. The door clicked shut behind them. Daniel stood still, the space between them full of things they had never said, some too old to matter, some too raw to touch. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she turned toward the window, arms still folded, as if steadying herself against what she was about to say. Then came the words, low, controlled, devastating. She waited. For 3 hours. Daniel flinched, just slightly. She kept looking at her watch, even though she doesn't know how to tell time yet. She kept asking me, "How long is 10 minutes? Mama." Ellie turned to face him now. Her voice was shaking, not with rage, but with something heavier. "I told her you wouldn't leave. I told her you were different now. I told her to trust you. She swallowed hard, and you vanished. I didn't mean Daniel started, but she cut him off with a sharp glance. No, don't." Her eyes filled, but no tears fell. She'd cried already, years ago. Tonight, she was steel. This wasn't just about you forgetting lunch plans. This was about her beginning to believe in someone finally, only to be shown, again, that people don't stay. Daniel lowered his gaze. His throat was tight. No words came. She didn't cry. Ellie went on. She didn't scream or throw a fit. "Do you know what she did?" She stepped forward, her voice now almost a whisper. She sat there on that bench, like she'd always known it would end this way. Daniel's breath caught. Ellie's next words were softer still, but they landed like thunder. "You made her believe you'd show up. You told her you wanted to know her. And then you left. Just like that. I got pulled into something urgent," he said, finally. "It wasn't intentional. I thought I'd be back in 10 minutes. "Stop," she said again. "This isn't about intentions. This is about impact." The room felt colder, or maybe it was just him. "I know your world is full of people who move fast and break things," Ellie said. "I know you're used to chasing what's next. But Lila isn't a business deal. She's a child. She's your child." Daniel opened his mouth, closed it again. He had no defense, not one that mattered. "You want to know what broke me the most?" Ellie asked, her voice finally cracking. It wasn't you disappearing. It was hearing her say, "I guess he changed his mind." Silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that screams. And then Ellie looked him in the eye, really looked. "Do you even know what it means to be a father?" Daniel. It wasn't said with bitterness. It was honest, brutally so. And Daniel, standing in a hotel room that now felt colder than any boardroom, realized he didn't have an answer. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to promise he could learn. But promises had already lost their weight. So instead, he just said, "I'm sorry." 2 words. Too late. Ellie looked away. "I thought you might be," she said. But that doesn't change what Lila felt, or what she now believes about people. She walked toward the door, paused. "I let you in because I thought maybe we could rewrite the story. I didn't expect perfection, but I expected presence." And then she left. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window, watching the lake turn dark, and then silver again under the early dawn light. His suitcase lay open beside the bed, untouched. But he knew what he was going to do. Later that morning, as the mist rose over Maple Lake, Daniel drove out of town without a word. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't knock on Ellie's door. He didn't try to explain again, because maybe leaving quietly felt like the only thing he could do that wouldn't cause more damage. Back at the house, Ellie stood by the window, watching a car disappear down the road. Her arms were wrapped tightly around herself, not for warmth, but for strength. She didn't cry. Not this time. Because some part of her had known, sometimes, to choose family. You have to let go of the empire you built. Daniel returned to Seattle on a red-eye flight, landing just as the city was stretching awake. The skyline, still wrapped in morning fog, shimmered under soft drizzle. It was exactly as he remembered it, but somehow it no longer felt like home. The car service waited at the terminal. The driver, cheerful and familiar, asked how Idaho had been. Daniel offered a polite nod, a vague response. He didn't mention the lake, or the child, or the fact that somewhere between Maple Lake and the runway, his heart had cracked open. He stepped back into his apartment, a sleek, modern space overlooking Puget Sound, floor-to-ceiling windows, smart lighting, walls that had never heard a child's laugh. The silence was too clean, too curated, too empty. He unpacked his duffel slowly, moving through muscle memory. But his hand stalled when he reached the drawing tucked between his folded shirts, Lila's sketch, the red maple tree, 3 stick figures beneath it, holding hands. He didn't put it on the fridge. He placed it on his nightstand, right beside the alarm clock he suddenly hated. Work swallowed him the next morning, just like always. Emails, meetings, crisis calls. His name still carried weight. His decisions still moved markets. But something had shifted. He sat in a strategy session, the skyline sprawling behind him, while Brandon, his CFO, clicked through a deck of projected growth. Texas was next, a 400-acre development that would require his full presence, months of travel, late nights, investor dinners, the same cycle, just with more zeros. He was supposed to be excited. Instead, Daniel stared at the screen as Brandon's voice faded into static. He saw Lila's eyes instead, her voice quiet and steady. "He's not coming back." She hadn't cried. That was what haunted him most. She had simply folded into the moment, as if life had taught her that even the brightest promises eventually disappear. He remembered Ellie's voice, too, steady, unsparing. "You made her believe you'd show up." And he hadn't. That night, he didn't sleep. He stood by the window in the dark, watching the fairy lights drift across the bay. The city shimmered with ambition. It pulsed with urgency. It always had. And for years, he had matched it breath for breath. But now, all he could think of was a small town in Idaho where breakfast came with crayons and second chances. At 3:12 a.m., he opened his laptop. The screen glowed against the darkness as he typed, "To the board effective immediately. I am resigning as CEO of Whitmore & Co. I will be selling a controlling interest in the company to the advisory group, per terms discussed last quarter. I will not be participating in the Texas Development Project. Thank you for the years of trust. It's time for someone else to take the lead. Daniel Whitmore." He hit send before he could second guess. No speeches, no press release. The next day, the news broke anyway. Whitmore resigns, sells controlling stake, walks away from empire. He built, headlines spun theories, burnout, backroom deal, silent acquisition, but no one guessed the truth, because the truth was simpler than any press could print. He missed his daughter, and this time, he wasn't going to lose her. His team called, panicked. Board members texted, reporters knocked on his door. Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he spent the next few days packing, quietly, deliberately. He left the suits in the closet, gave away half the wine collection, donated the designer coffee table. The space began to echo without the noise of his old life. And then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, he sat down and wrote one last message. Not to the board, not to the press, to her, to Eleanor Sanders. Subject home. I'm coming home, if you'll let me. No dramatic punctuation, no begging, just a sentence carved from honesty. He hovered over the send button for a moment, then pressed it, and sat back in the silence. At that very hour, Ellie stood by the kitchen window. Lila was at the dining table, humming softly while coloring today's masterpiece featured owls in scarves. Outside, the wind pushed through the trees. The sky was that soft steel gray that always came before snow. Her phone buzzed once on the counter. She dried her hands, picked it up, and read the email. Once, twice. I'm coming home, if you'll let me. No grand declarations, no apologies layered in self-pity, just a man finally asking for something that mattered more than pride. She didn't answer right away. She just stood there, eyes fixed on the road beyond the pines, as if expecting a car to appear. Her heart was quiet, but not unmoved. She had learned not to trust words alone. But still. She held the phone in both hands, and, for a long while, just breathed. Because this time, the silence felt different. The hardest promise isn't to love. It's to stay even when it's uncomfortable. Daniel returned to Maple Lake without ceremony. No suitcase this time, just a worn canvas duffel, a cooler of groceries, and a key to a small cedar cabin overlooking the water. It wasn't much, a single-story home with creaky floorboards, mismatched kitchen tiles, and a wood-burning stove that hadn't worked properly in years. But it was close to the diner, close to Ellie, close to Lila. And for the first time in decades, that was exactly where Daniel wanted to be. He didn't rush. He didn't ask Ellie for a second chance. Didn't show up with flowers or speeches or apologies reheated from the past. Instead, he showed up at 6:15 every morning with a clean thermos and a quiet offer. Need help with prep. Some days she nodded. Some days she didn't. But he came anyway. He learned how to slice onions without crying, how to refill the syrup jugs without spilling, how to fix the squeaky hinge on the kitchen door. And slowly. Ellie stopped flinching when she saw him standing there. At 7:45 sharp, he walked Lila to school. He didn't take her hand at first. She held her backpack tight, eyes on the sidewalk, talking mostly about science projects and lunchroom drama. But over time, she started asking questions. Did you ever ride the school bus? What's your favorite constellation? Do all grown-ups get tired at the same time every day? He answered as best he could. Once, She surprised him by slipping her hand into his without a word. They walked 2 blocks like that, just 2, but he remembered every step. Afternoons were slower. Daniel read on the porch, walked by the lake, chopped firewood even when he didn't need it. The stillness was new, unfamiliar, but it felt like breathing after holding his breath for too long. He didn't see Lila every day, didn't try to force it, but sometimes she'd appear with a drawing, or a question, or just to sit beside him while he peeled apples for pie. He didn't speak much on those afternoons. He'd learned that presence speaks louder than promises. One evening, near the end of October, Ellie called. It wasn't dramatic. Just a quick ask. Lila's teacher had an emergency. Could he pick her up from after-school art club? He said yes. She was waiting near the front doors, swinging her lunchbox like a pendulum. When she saw him, her face lit up, not wide-eyed surprise, but something quieter. Familiarity. Trust. "Hey," he said. "Hey." She echoed and fell into step beside him. They didn't talk much on the walk home. The sun was setting. Maple leaves crunched beneath their feet. Daniel noticed how the streetlights flickered on one by one, like stars in the neighborhood sky. When they reached the cabin, she walked in ahead of him, dropped her backpack near the couch, and disappeared down the hall. He made tea, lit a few candles, started to slice apples again. And then he heard it. Quick footsteps, a rush of breath, then arms flung tight around his middle. Daddy. The word hit him like thunder in a quiet room. He froze, knife in hand, breath caught, eyes wide. Lila, but she didn't let go. Her small arms were warm, solid, real, her cheek pressed against his chest, and something inside Daniel cracked open. He dropped the knife, wrapped his arms around her, and held her like she might vanish. A tear slipped down his cheek, then another. He didn't wipe them away.
Because for the first time since she was born, he allowed himself to say it in the privacy of his heart. I'm her father. Not in name, not in theory, but in truth. Across the street, Ellie stood in her kitchen, mug of tea in hand. Through the soft glow of the window, she saw the movement inside the cabin, the brief, unmistakable moment of their embrace. She didn't move, didn't knock, didn't interrupt, but her hand tightened slightly around the mug. And for the first time in weeks, the tears that came didn't burn. They softened. Because sometimes the heart breaks from absence, and sometimes it breaks open. He once built towers. Now he builds pancakes and evening stories, and it's enough. The snow came early that year. By mid-November, Maple Lake was already laced with frost and trimmed in white. The pine trees stood tall and silent, wrapped in their wintry coats. Smoke curled from chimneys. Footsteps crunched lightly on narrow town roads. And in a small cabin near the water's edge, Daniel Whitmore was learning how to live a new life, not a louder life, not a richer one, but a life that mattered. He rose each morning before the sun. The old floorboards creaked under his slippers. He'd light the fire, grind coffee beans by hand, and pour 2 cups, one for him, one he'd walk across the road to the diner. Ellie never asked for it, but she never said no. Sometimes they'd talk, sometimes not. Some mornings were filled with quiet glances and the scraping of spatulas against pans. Other mornings came with soft laughter and stories of Lila's newest science obsession. Daniel didn't push, didn't pry. He was just there, and that, in itself, was new. Each weekday, he walked Lila to school. She still wore that knitted bear cap, faded now, stretched from use, and sometimes skipped every third step on the sidewalk, humming a song she never quite finished. He carried her backpack when she asked, let her carry it when she didn't. They had their rituals now, counting how many squirrels they saw,
guessing the temperature by breath clouds, arguing playfully over whether breakfast sandwiches were better with ketchup. She didn't call him Daddy every day. She didn't have to. It was in the way she looked for him first at school pickup, in the way she slipped her hand into his when traffic passed, in the way she said, "Are you staying for dinner?" like it was more invitation than question. And he always said yes. Daniel learned that loving a child wasn't about grand gestures. It was wiping up spilled juice without sighing. It was rereading the same bedtime book even when he was tired. It was holding her coat open on cold mornings and listening, really listening, when she talked about the dream she had where her math teacher turned into a pancake. It was staying. Again and again. He and Ellie weren't lovers. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But there were long looks over cups of tea, soft silences between errands, small moments that felt like healing. One evening, as they closed up the diner, she reached for his hand, just for a second. He didn't squeeze it, didn't say a word, but he didn't let go either. And that was enough. The town had grown used to him now. He wasn't the CEO from Seattle anymore. He was the man who shoveled the sidewalk before the bakery opened, who helped Coach Wiggins set up bleachers before school games, who bought firewood in bulk and gave half away to the elderly woman 3 cabins down. He had money. Sure. But that wasn't what people saw. They saw the man who showed up and stayed. One Sunday afternoon in January, the snow paused just long enough for the sun to break through the clouds. The lake sparkled, half frozen, half reflecting the wide, open sky. Ellie suggested a walk. Lila threw on her scarf before the question was finished, and Daniel grabbed a thermos of hot chocolate and followed them out the door. They strolled the lake path slowly. No one said much. The air didn't need filling. Lila twirled in the snow, then ran ahead to chase her footprints. Daniel and Ellie walked behind, their arms brushing now and then, their breath curling into the cold. The stillness wasn't awkward. It was sacred. Daniel looked at the 2 people ahead of him, the girl in motion, the woman steady, and felt, for the first time in his life, the full weight of peace. Not happiness, not success, but peace. The kind that doesn't shout. The kind that sits quietly inside your chest and says, "This is where you belong." That evening, back at the cabin, Lila's sketchbook lay open on the table. Daniel noticed a new drawing. 3 figures, like always. Under the red maple tree she never stopped including, but now there were details. Ellie's hair was longer. Daniel's glasses were too big. Lila had drawn herself with arms stretched wide like she was about to jump. And the 3 of them, they were smiling. He picked up the paper gently, held it to his chest, and closed his eyes. He didn't need a frame. This wasn't art. This was proof. He once built towers. Now he builds pancakes and evening stories, and it's enough because he didn't go back to the city. Not for meetings, not for legacy, not even for closure. Because for the first time in his life, home wasn't made of glass and steel. It was made of hand-holding and morning walks, of forgiveness and folding napkins, of red maple trees and second chances. It was made of heartbeats, and he had finally learned how to listen to them. Sometimes, the greatest success in life isn't what we build, but who we choose to show up for. Daniel Whitmore spent years chasing titles, numbers, and recognition. But all the while, he was missing the quiet moments that truly matter: a child's laughter, a shared morning coffee, a walk beside someone who stays when things get hard. This story reminds us that it's never too late to turn around. We can't go back and rewrite the beginning, but we can choose how the next chapter unfolds. Sometimes that means putting down the briefcase, turning off the phone, and simply being present with the people who matter most. Being a parent, a partner, a friend, These roles aren't defined by perfection, but by presence. And no matter how far you've drifted, the road home is always open if you're willing to walk it with humility, patience, and heart. Because in the end, it's not the legacy we leave behind in headlines, it's the one we build quietly, day by day, in the hearts of those we love. Thank you for spending your time with us. If this story touched your heart, we'd be so grateful if you could like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing meaningful stories to life. Until next time, take care of your heart and those you love.